Opposite Sharia by Jamshid Sharifi. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Anand Gopal is our guest. He's covered Afghanistan, Egypt, other countries in the region for various newspapers and magazines, currently working on a book about the history of the Afghan war. And on Tuesday, he returned from Syria. But before we talk about Syria, Anand, this latest revelation by the Los Angeles Times of these photographs, they're so gruesome. They would only print two, which were incredibly gruesome, and they said that they were the best of them. And the attack by Leon Panetta on the LA Times for even printing those. Your response?
Well, as Hakeem said, I think they shock us actually more than they shock Afghans, because, I mean, from the Afghan perspective, we've had troops urinating on corpses, a massacre of 17 civilians, airstrikes, night raids, troops cutting off fingers for sport. And so for Afghans, this is part and parcel of the experience of being in war. And there's a lot of concern, I think, in Washington about us losing the Afghans with these sorts of incidents. But I think their concerns are misplaced because we've already lost them, really, over all these incidents over the last few years.
And the U.S. military, I saw some of the generals or retired generals last night basically saying, well, these are isolated incidents. They don't represent the general conduct of U.S. troops. But isn't there a reality that as any occupation drags on and an army realizes that it is in contradiction with the very people it's supposed to be protecting, these kinds of incidents tend to escalate and grow. And it's been seen in many other wars in the past, wars of occupation.
Oh, absolutely, and they keep talking about rotten apples, but you have to wonder how many rotten apples you have to see before you realize that the tree itself is a problem. And this is the experience of Afghans under occupation, and I think, and as you mentioned, under other occupations. I mean, talking to troops who've been there or living with troops, I mean, they're trained to view every single person as an enemy, and they're trained to dehumanize the enemy. And so these things follow from that. And you can't really run an occupation without having this mentality, because if you start seeing Afghans as human beings, then all of a sudden you're going to think twice before shooting at them.
I want to ask you in terms of this whole issue of the United States withdrawing in 2014, will your sense of whether there will be a genuine withdrawal, and also that Afghanistan had a previous experience with a foreign army withdrawing when the Soviet army withdrew after a 10-year occupation and war, and that only ended up in an eruption of a new civil war within Afghanistan that led to the rise of the Taliban.
Right, and this status of forces agreement, which was just signed, speaks to this, which is essentially saying that the U.S. troops can stay, what implies that they can stay in perpetuity. In other words, that the U.S. troops won't be subject to the laws of Afghanistan. And the reason that was set up is so that the U.S. can enable themselves to stay there for forever, essentially. I think a lot of the troops will probably be withdrawn, but we'll see special forces staying on the ground. This will be the state of affairs unless something happens like they're forced to leave by the Taliban, which I think is unlikely.